I'm here till the 28th. We buried my mum on Tuesday last. That's the main reason. It's been a very interesting process. It has been all right. How would I describe it? I described it as feeling untethered to the earth, having lost both parents now. With her passing, there is a sort of link that you have to the earth and to the past, which is more immediate when your parents are alive. I suppose that has gone. It keeps reminding me of the Gregory Porter song, which has a lyric which goes, I feel just like a kite, but one without a string, one that is floating. I don't know what tomorrow may bring. But that is also quite freeing, I suppose. Untethered, but equally sort of free. The last couple of days, I have been thinking you have little time on this place. It is really a matter of just allowing yourself to be. And I suppose for a long period in my life, before I came home, there were things that, because my parents were around, up until that point, I felt like, I can't quite be totally myself or totally honest with the world, life itself, and my reaction to not being fully me led me to take that position and be me. So that happened before they passed. But in some ways, them both going now allows you even more freedom to be fabulously fierce and you yourself. Not that I wasn't. It just gives you a sort of freedom whilst also being sad that you are somehow not quite as linked. I don't know that I truly believe that, because I do believe that I used to look on my two grandmothers, neither of whom I knew well, both of whom I only met a couple of times. And I used to look back at them, and on the Bajan side, I would think, well, she's really only one generation away from slavery. And on the Nigerian side, again, one generation away from colonialism in its heyday. And those were two really strong, wonderful women who both had multiple children and were the linchpins of the family. So I used to look on them as my anchor, my just above my shoulders, wishing me well in whatever came along. And so now that both parents have passed, I suppose I feel that they are there with them. I think there's definitely a sense of that. And once you are totally aware of that, like Toni Morrison, I suppose, don't fear it as much, then the duty is to live. The duty is to live fully, And so, yeah, I feel that greatly. Do no harm, live fully. He used to call me his Nigerian friend from birth till 7 in Nigeria, and in Barbados, in and out, born in Nigeria.
Okay.
The voice is more to do with the fact that at the time that I was born, Nigeria was still a colony. And I suppose being of a certain earning bracket, the schooling at that point, even if only nursery and the beginning of primary, it was sort of private affairs at the time in what would be called the British expat colonial boarding school, although I was a day student in Nigeria, in Lagos. So, yeah, I suppose that is a lot of it. If you look back to the early 60s, late 50s, West Caribbean and Africans who had spent a lot of time in Britain or getting educated in that latter part, also, I suppose, like BBC pronouncers took on the BBC English. That was an interesting period, I suppose. I had very childlike impressions of what Britain, the mother country, would be. It was very much a child's vision. It involved a sort of castle on a twirly island, as in the cartoon type. It involved the Beatles. It involved Elvis. Well, actually, more Elvis than the Beatles, because Nigeria was a few behind, I suppose. And it involved red buses. It involved taxi cabs. It was very different from the reality. It was one of those things where you arrived and we were, we'd come from Biafra, war-torn Nigeria. That had been going on a couple of years. And essentially, we came from that via Portugal and landed at Heathrow and were met by on my mum's side, drove to Shepherd's Bush. It was very different from my childlike image of what this fantasy land was going to be like. It was early evening. It was quite dark for early evening. I remember she wanted to get back to watch Coronation Street. Yeah, those were the impressions. I remember being somewhat stunned by going past Shepherd's Bush Green and seeing people looking a little disheveled, let's put it that way. I had an impression that I was going to meet the Queen and Elvis.
Although
it was all part of the same stuff. I came with better English than I was coming to, And so that was interesting and difficult. It meant you didn't quite fit in with young, black, mainly West Indian descent children in the school I was in Shepherd's Bush. In fact, the first school I left after a very short while because some West Indian kid, Andrew, I can't remember his second name, but he came up to me in the changing rooms on the second day that I was there and asked me where the bone from my nose had gone. And we got into a fight. I left there shortly after. It was interesting being in the next school, finding lots of difficulties which you just had to traverse. We were very much a family unit with mum only. My dad was still in Nigeria. He remained. And so it was mum and 4 kids living in Shepherd's Bush mostly, and then moving to Fulham and feeling like fish out of water, having come from quite a middle upper class background in Nigeria. They met here. They were both studying here. My uncle, who was studying with my dad, invited the 2 other black students. They were all studying engineering. He invited them back because he had his sisters with him who were also studying different subjects. He invited them back because he wanted them to have at least one decent meal a week. Both those guys ended up marrying my mum and her sister. Dad went back to Nigeria to run NITEL, the Nigerian Telephone Service. My uncle Claude came back to Barbados to run Ready Kilowatt, or the Barbados Electric Company. Morris went back to Grenada to run his equivalent. So they were, you've got to remember that in those days, we're talking CLR James, people like that, lots of intellectuals, Wallachy, George Lamming, these sort of folks. In 1968 was the 5th Pan-African Congress in Manchester with all these people who went back to, Kenyatta and various others, achieving guys and girls who came and studied, and lots of them went back and ran their countries, became the future presidents as independence came up. Nigeria got independence, then we had a civil war. There's a lot of stuff about the change of name of Nigeria and whether we should stick to that or move to something else. Because do you want to be named after the mistress of the governor or whatever he was at the time, named Nigeria, put these regions together for their economic benefit?
Tricks.
At school, I suppose it had been there before, but at school, in secondary school, in Holland Park, was when I really took an interest. When my parents were splitting, was when it really came up. I had had an interest before, and I was not allowed to because it was frivolous, and also it was something for the older years to get involved with. And I was at that point just a first year at secondary school. There was suspicion that these sixth formers might drink on the night of the show, so I wasn't allowed to join in. I had to go straight home after being part of the chorus. But later on, when I was going through some emotional adjustment, in terms of parent splitting and other stuff, and dealing with lots of other things, stuff that I kept quiet about. That was my sort of escape. A teacher suggested that I might find the solution to whatever is troubling me in a copy of the complete works of William Shakespeare. All human emotion is in here. So whatever it is, you might want to have a read of this, have a look. And I did find some situations within a couple of those plays. I didn't read through the whole canon immediately or anything like that. I read a couple of the plays and I could find some confused individuals working out their stuff. Hamlet, Twelfth Night, those are the two. Later on, for study, I read Macbeth, and I could understand feeling murderous. And I definitely related to the witches and the fact that fate was there and they would play a game with you. At that early stage, I had thought about doing an all-black version of Julius Caesar, looking at the sort of Gawain figures. As far as I could see, most of these guys in these families, and my family knew Ojukwu. You know, I served in Colonial as the young when he came to the house just before the Nigerian-Biafra conflict. All these guys had been to the same sort of military colleges. Here they were, a bit like Brutus, Cassius, Caesar, and Antony, all fighting, and all the people dying around them whilst they sorted out the division of countries. And I did think about putting that on. I thought, oh God, they'll kill you in Nigeria if you put that out. I can't remember which particular military dictator was in power at the time when I was thinking about it. I don't think it was Abacha. It may have been, I can't remember, but I was in secondary school. A lot later on, I got to do Julius Caesar. Well, I've long said that the European versions of Shakespeare are interesting, but in an African context, what you get is a belief in gods, kings, and men, very apparent in most African societies. So it's very visceral and very real. When you put Shakespeare into an African context, it becomes
real
in the same way that Shakespeare had to fear for King James or Elizabeth taking his head off or something, which is why he always trod a very careful line. So it becomes very real, and you've got the groundlings and you've got the kings and the gods. And so, yeah, it becomes very visceral, it becomes very different in that score.
I think you came out relatively late. What took you so?
What took me so long? Lots of things took me so long. I suppose it wasn't an issue. Well, it wasn't an issue when I was growing up. On the one hand, it was a big issue. On the other hand, I was at Holland Park, where although I wasn't out, it was a time in the 70s when at schools like Holland Park, which was modern comprehensive with new ideas on teaching, a very mixed school, a big modern comprehensive of 2,000 odd students from all backgrounds. Its setting is in Holland Park, Notting Hill, quite a rich area and yet also quite a poor area.
Yes.
People from as far as Greenford, you've got Ladbroke Grove, the whole influence of what was going on in Ladbroke Grove throughout the 60s, Carnival, all that sort of influence. You've got the sort of posh end of things. You've got kids from Shepherd's Bush like me or Fulham. You've got an attitude towards life which is punky and funky. You know, you had members of Aswad at the school. You had Yaz, you had Tom, head designer at Habitat, Laura Ashley's children, you had Tony Benn's children. It was a wild, wonderful atmosphere. So sleeping with men, sleeping with women, it was just sort of part of you just did whatever you were doing. On the one hand, it was there, it was open, it was whatever. It was also quite secretive. You had Keith Moon's daughter at school. I remember going to Mandy's house after school and thinking, this is wild. You had people taking all sorts of stuff. They didn't seem to be a responsible adult. There were lots of adults there, but they definitely weren't responsible. She was sort of bringing up herself at the time, yet overlooking Hyde Park in this apartment, which in today's equivalent would be many, many millions. It was sort of there and not there. I was in a funny position of being able to sort of do little forays into that area. Well, I suppose I didn't quite realize. Let me put it this way. I remember going back with a friend of mine. He'll remain nameless. But I remember going back to his flat in Shepherd's Bush, which was on the green. It was one of those big tower blocks that overlooks the green itself. And we went back, and me, him, and his sister indulged in sort of experimenting with each other, all three of us. Now, there was a bit of me that came away feeling very guilty that I had essentially got excited, but mainly for him. It never occurred to me till many years later there was something odd in this picture. And the odd thing in this picture was that he was doing this with his sister. That tells you that I was aware that, oh my God, this is wrong what I'm doing. Yeah, it was, I suppose all kids are self-obsessed. I was aware that, I had received homophobia or whatever, that this was wrong. So much so that I blanked out the other part of what was wrong in
But
this
incest.
picture. Yeah, in this picture. I blanked out what was wrong in that picture because I was obviously so, somebody may find out. And it was many years later, I went, Cyril, you know what? The thing that's really up here, I never really thought about it like that till I was an adult. What
So
affected
next day you went back still?
Sort of hung out, but I was very wary of, oh my goodness, I think I fancied him.
And you never repeated that?
No, and I think that was because I was so scared that I might go down that road. I did later on do that again, but with others, not with their sisters. Yeah. I remember there was a lane behind Holland Park School, and when I was rehearsing for a play, I was about 17, I think, at the time. And at night, we'd be rehearsing in this room. And the lane ran between the wall of the school, and then you had a sort of lane that went up through Holland Park. Well, I didn't know it was famous at the time, and you would see these men there. Yeah.
Wow.
And that...
It's very close.
She didn't cause it. It was way before Bonnie came to the country. So, yeah, I saw that. And I remember at that rehearsal, I made a mental note that I should visit there one night. And I did, and it got me in trouble. It got me in trouble because I met somebody and we started walking into the bushes, having climbed over the fence into Holland Park itself. And out of everywhere came policemen.
Goodness.
And I and he were charged with gross indecency. I don't know how, because I hadn't actually gotten anything out yet, but
You were still
I was
officially a child.
I was still officially a child, and it went to court, and I was charged, and I was desperately worried that it would get, and it was in a paper. I remember refusing the help of, I think they were Stonewall or something, came up and asked whether, and I didn't want to have anything to do with it. I just wanted to keep it quiet. It was many, many years later that conviction was quashed. That conviction, and I had to write to the Home Office and whatever else, and it was quashed and taken out.
Oh, wow.
Many, many years later. But up until then, it was a secret. It was a thing of, and that helped to keep me in the closet for many years. But I didn't really think of it in terms of in the closet or not. I just thought, okay, this is something you do. I also fancied women. And I have 2 children. We were together a long time, 14 years, I think. Yeah. Well, yeah, it's longer than most. But it wasn't an issue of, it was many years into that I suppose we'd been together 12 years when I started feeling like this isn't me. And I needed to be honest with myself because an incident happened. I was unfaithful, having got drunk. in that partnership. And I saw that guy a few times. And I knew that I was drawn to that. And I tried to cover it by drinking each time I got together with them. It was the drink, it was the this, and it was the that, it was the whatever. But as that went on for a little while, I just became aware that this is me. And I can either live a lie or I can be me. It got to the stage where it just became untenable to not be me. Over a meal, it took some time, you know. I stopped drinking. I stopped taking any form of recreational drug. And as that cleared my head, it became totally untenable. I became quite depressed, I suppose. This is something that I have to do because it would be unfair to keep somebody else hostage because I'm too scared to be me. In the end, I had to face that. And it was difficult because I had 2 kids. At the time, we were the only in my family, offering the only grandchildren to either side. And we had been together longer than either of our parents had been together in their marriages. So yeah, there was a lot relying on it. I was 33, 34. So yeah, that's 26 odd years. You know, I had a fairly public career, which was doing fairly well. So there were a lot of fronts on which it was going to be difficult. And whilst I never ran around shouting it from the rooftops, I was just honest about that. And yeah, it meant a lot of change. It meant giving a lot of hurt to people, being more aware in terms of who I was. We bury things deep down. Sometimes we push this shit down so far that we don't even know. And it's so far received, this homophobia, you know. But in the end, I think it comes down to a choice of, do I live? In all senses of the words, do I live? Not just physically, which, you know, was a consideration. Do I live physically? And do I live mentally and spiritually, being me? Or do I die on all those fronts? It's interesting now because we've been through a lot of stuff. With my eldest, it's really good. You know, she is a girl now. And my second child, it's not that great. You know, but that's not to do with me being out or stuff. It's to do with just the ongoing personalities. That discussion started quite young. When he was 13, just coming up to 14, we discussed it. And then from there were lots of conversations and things that carried on. And then at the end of university, the transition took place. We're all fine with it and it's all good. It's not my drama. So
I mean,
I'm very aware of
film.
You know, there's a film there. If you want it, whose point of view would you write that film from? Would you have the right to write that drama? I don't know. It's interesting. I know that one of my neighbors wrote a book about a person who lives in my area and whose child went to the same school as my children, wrote a story about her child and their drug addiction. And it was, I suppose it's your right to write a story about your child's drug addiction. Is it your story to write? I know it caused friction. At the moment, I'm writing something which is not my story, which is based on the story of people not related to me at all, but a historical incident. I'm not actually concentrating on that historical incident. I'm concentrating on the lives before it. Now, I don't know, I'm trying to do the research, but there is a story that I want to tell, which is piggybacking on the setting up of this story, a tragedy that happened, but I've never been interested in what I call torture porn. There's enough of that out there. I'm not interested in seeing black people up against a wall being tortured. Maybe it does something for white supremacists, homophobes, or whatever, but it doesn't do a lot for me. So I'm concentrating on the build-up of this wonderful society and the people within it. Now, do I have a right to tell that story? I'm not sure that I do. It's an inspiration. There's no story that's new. You know, I'm very aware there's no story at all that's new. And yeah, so I'm allowed to use the bare bones of that and see whether I can create a drama out of it with a very personal, close to story. There may be a time when we are far enough away when we can look at that and say, yeah, it's all right to tell this. I would want it documented in some way because I think it's very important that lives which so long have historically been marginalized or written out of history and allowed to disappear, purposefully allowed to disappear.
Yes.
Wantonly made to disappear. So I do think it's important to record it. That's why I'm doing this, because I think it's important to have a record of lives that are lived proudly. When some things, you know, are rewritten from the bare bones, from the facts, years after you are gone, maybe that is the lens through which to look at them. Some distance. Then again, there are stories which need to be told in the now because things need to be changed. There is no point in allowing people to hide behind some sort of, we need a distance on this before we can truly ascertain what was going on. Because actually Grenfell, Windrush, stories of homophobia that are happening right now, we cannot allow our Priti Patels or our Boris Johnsons or our whatevers away with, you know, oh, well, we need to have some sort of historical
rubbish
on this, because you're not listening to the stories of the past and you want to wipe them away with the current stories. At some point, either you're going to have to learn the lessons of the past, or we're going to have to come up and say, this is in your face right now because people are dying. One of the reasons that I step up as a black gay man with kids, with all that stuff, is to say, oh yeah, you know, you too, you know, and you don't have to hide. I don't think I was made brave. I would never condemn anybody for not, you know, doing whatever I feel is necessary. I am a black gay man with kids who does Shakespeare. I have to stand up because it's important that I stand up. Otherwise, you'll be able to get away with saying shit. You know, I have to stand up because people like Labi Sifri stood up. I have to stand up because, you know, Essex Hempel stood up. If I don't, then every so often, and I'm not that well known or that big or whatever, and maybe I would be better known if I kept my mouth shut, you know, as a friend of mine says, well, as an agent said to me, yeah, so but why do you have to say it? And I said, because the room is silent otherwise. Therefore, I have to say it, because otherwise people may walk out of this room thinking it's not a problem to say that. So I have to stand up and say, hang on a second, there's a lot of challenges out there. I have to challenge my fears. I have to challenge the fact that I've been fearful for 34 years and I didn't even know it. It was so embedded in me that at 13, fondling as kids do with each other, discovering sexuality, I missed the fact that somebody I was fondling with was also fondling with his sister, because I was so scared of admitting to myself that I was sexually attracted to this boy. And that was so abhorrent to me in terms of what I had received about who I was, who I should be, that was the main occupation of my mind. So I have to stand up and go, hold on a second, sir. This is valid what you feel. This is valid. You're allowed to lie. Rabbi Sifri has a song called Why Isn't Love Enough? Go look it up. And this is a man who had a relationship with his partner at the time, and his current partner has had long-term relationships. The time that I met Rabbi first, I think he'd been in a relationship for 30-something years. He knew my mom and worked with her. I'd met this other guy that would occasionally come along. He was a public figure doing charity work and whatever else. I went, use his name because he hasn't given me. But it was only years and years after that I found out that these two men lived together and had been together all this time. I mean, now they're in their 90s and they have been together like 50-something years. And when they first got together, it was desperately illegal. This was, fully on, you go to jail. Yet they had this relationship from being young men, in their 20-somethings. And one of them having traveled from the Caribbean to Britain. And they were together. How valid is that? How wonderful is that?
The stories we don't hear about.
Why am I not seeing this? Why I feel ashamed is because I don't know about it. I don't know that this is possible. I don't know that you can live this because they're having to live it behind closed doors, essentially.
Yes.
For the most part. And even though some people know, oh yeah, they're together, we never acknowledge it. He can go up before the Queen and get his medal for Empire, whatever, and nobody actually knows this other person that came along is their partner, the love of their life. How wonderful it would have been to go, oh yeah,
You're Madge.
this is a role model. This is somebody who I don't have to hide. I can be out there. I can say, it's all right to be me.